Well, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. I'm Steve Hoberman. I manage Technics Publications. We are a publishing company that specializes in data-focused books, and very proud to introduce Roger Brolton, who wrote the book Business Architecture, correcting, actually capturing, correcting, and connecting the dots. I love that subtitle, and I think it really summarizes Roger's approach to the book, which is very holistic, where we've published a lot of books that are valuable within certain niche areas like data modeling and data governance. And then every once in a while, I'll meet an author and we'll publish a book that takes a much more holistic approach. And it requires a very special kind of person to write a book like that, somebody who has a specialty in one area. So in Roger's case, it would be business process management, and also has a lot of knowledge of other areas and is able to kind of, using his subtitle, connect the dots. And I think it's a brilliant book. I think I've actually read the book a few times working with Roger on the publishing process. And what I really admire about the book is how the book doesn't take sides. It doesn't say you have to do it this way, you can't do it this way. It's able to show the big picture and yet explain when something works and when something doesn't work. And it's just a very impressive work. And with that, I'd like to introduce Roger Brolton. Thanks, Roger. Oh, wait, applause.
Yeah, I think maybe we should do the applause at the end if you like my presentation. So, but yeah, I like to thank Steve. Steve has put, I think he's read the book more times than I have, because I think if anybody who's ever published anything before, you write it, you read it, you change it, you read it again, and pretty soon it becomes like blah. I don't see anything on the page. It's so hard to write. So I really appreciate anyone who's done this before. It's 20 years since the last time I did this, it's sort of like I forgot the pain I went through last time, but to do it this time. It's an interesting topic. I mean, the name came to me, and this story is in the book, but the name came to me when I was in Sydney doing a conference, and that conference was called Process Days, was something that Roger Tregear had set up as part of Leonardo Consulting, and we were at the end of the day, nice sunshine, overlooking Darling Harbour. Anybody who knows Sydney, it's a beautiful spot, overlooking the harbour. And we'd had a few beers, as people do at the end of the day in Australia or many other places. And so we got into discussion about, well, no one's connecting the dots. No, everybody's got these little niche areas, as Steve talked about, but no one's connecting the dots. And so and we were talking about process management. We were talking about enterprise architecture. We were talking about all these things where we have to sort of strategizing and define what the organization should all be about. And then then someone said, yeah, but if we don't collect them, we can't connect them. I thought, well, that's brilliant. And so we what we decided to do is go through the alphabet and look for any other letter that sort of fit in. And the only other one was the R. Because the other ones didn't make a word. So I said, well, this is brilliant. This is what we've got here. And I said at that time, one day I'm going to write a book called Collecting, Connecting, and Correcting the Dots. And that's sort of how that came about. But the idea, as Steve has said, it is intended to be holistic. There are a lot of people who don't include certain aspects of what I've covered here in what they would call business architecture. They're much more focused on certain aspects. I've taken a very broad view, and some people would probably claim that certain things I've talked about are not really business architecture. There's something else. Their strategy, their portfolio management, there's some other domain which they see as business architecture. And honestly, I fully expect to get some blowback from some people, with names not to be mentioned, who are going to think that this isn't exactly the way that we put it or that somebody else puts it. But I have tried to be open. However, as the people here who met me before will know, there's certain places you can't go beyond certain limits where it's just not going to be true and it's just not going to work. So you have to still stick to your principles in going forward in all of this. So that's really what the book is all about. So I'm just going to just do just a handful of slides, and then we can talk and talk about it some more. Okay. So you all know me. So I always feel that, you know, in anything I do, I try to understand what the end is going to be before I start talking about the means. This is very much Stephen Covey's like number 2, begin with the end in mind. But you do have to have an end. And that's sort of like the situation here in this little matrix, this 2x2, which says that, you know, I know where I want to go. At least I hope I do, or I better figure that out first. But I don't really know how I'm going to get there. So you got to start there. So like it says here, a dream is the, you know, knowing your vision, but not really knowing how you're going to accomplish that. This quadrant we typically start. I want to get here. I want to get to the point where I have this dream and I want it to come true. And you all know, you've seen so many organizations, and all your organizations do this. They have these great 5-year strategies, 2025, 2030 strategy, all those types of things. When people say things like, by 2030, we will be the largest market share in our industry. That means we're going to double our revenue in 10 years. Great. Now, do you have any idea how you're going to do that? Is a really good question. So, if you figured out how you're going to do it, then your dream can come true. But you have these other things down here, and there are lots of people doing this architectural type of work, where they really don't know where they're going, and they have no means to do it. But everyone's trying to do something, and there's like 25 different things taking place. Nobody is clear on what the end purpose is. That is just a pure nightmare. And staying with the sleep analogies, sometimes we have all the means in the world. In other words, if you could take some of the stuff in the book, skip the first few chapters and go right to how do we build models of processes, value streams, capabilities, performance measures, data. I got all these great techniques for that, but I have no idea what I'm going to use it for. And so there are business architecture groups who are great at the techniques, and they'll argue the techniques forever, but they're not connected to the why. And I think, you know, connecting to the why is something that I think is really quite important. And that's really what I've tried to do here, is give us some hope of getting there. But as it says here, a dream is not sufficient. I thought this was a really interesting quote from James Cameron. That's why I want to grab the Titanic image. So when he said, you know, basically, hope, however, is not a strategy, but also luck is not a factor. And also fear is not an option. I like those statements with regard to what a lot of us are trying to do architecturally with organizations and so on. It's, you know, it's pretty daunting to try to do some of the transformations that people are doing today, especially when you've sort of marshaled the whole organization to all go out there and do it all at once without much synchronization or organization, and each group's supposed to do its own thing. You have no idea if it's going to come together, right? So, but you got to get on the journey, right? And so another 2x2, just some of you know this one already. This is, you know, the idea that when we're doing this, though, we do have to build models. We know it. The real world is too complex. So the idealization is easier to work with the models sometimes than it is to work with reality. And so the models, as I said, this is probably my favorite quote here, though. It says, George Bach said this: all models are wrong, but some are useful. And we have to accept that the abstraction is not going to be perfect. So, and it does go like this, that quite often when we get going, we're sitting in here, we don't have a lot of detail, and we really don't understand much. But we sit in this quadrant over here. By the way, the executives live in this quadrant for the most part, the business executives. Like, you say, okay, great. I really don't know what I'm talking about, and I have nothing to base it on, but I'm still going to say we can do this in 3 years with $10 million, right? And you know, how'd you get that is a good question. And then that becomes the budget, that becomes the time frame. We're all marching to some what looks like arbitrary statement. And as architects and analysts, we know that we've got to get in to figure it out. And the first thing that happens is we go and gather a lot of information. It becomes overwhelming, the amount of information we have. And I refer to this quadrant here as, this is where initiatives go to die. And I've seen so many of these, like 3 years in, we got all this detail. We don't think it's going to fit together, so we can the project. I mean, I worked with one organization in the Netherlands, and they spent 100 million euros in 3 years, and they realized, oh, this isn't going to work. And so they threw the whole thing out. Well, and what was the loss? It wasn't 100 million euros. That was not an issue to them. The issue was they lost 3 years in market, where everybody else had moved forward. So yeah, we will be here, and it will feel terrible. But if we stay at it, we'll figure out, okay, it's just complex. But now we understand the complexity, but we couldn't explain it to anyone to save our lives, right? Because only we could, or either that, or nobody will listen to us. We got to get it back up to being what I call elegant, which is not a whole lot of detail, but really very rich understanding of what's taking place. Right? It's sort of that, you know, Einstein's famous statement, E equals mc squared. That's pretty elegant. Took him 20 years, but E equals mc squared is what came out of it. And so I think that as architects, one of the things I'm trying to do is say, okay, let's not get lost down here. We need to be able to communicate. We need to be able to stay simple, but we need a rich understanding of what's taking place. So that's really what we're aiming for. And the other thing that a lot of people say, this may be a technicality, but a lot of people will say, oh, our job is to translate this into that, this into something else. Having worked in an organization that had translators and interpreters, it was sort of like a United Nations type of organization, many countries and big meetings and things like that. I said to them, well, why didn't you, have the interpreters and the translators sitting in the same group, so that way you could swap them around? And they just laughed at me and said, interpretation is not translation. You don't just translate what someone has said into something precisely the same way. That's when you write books. You can translate. But when you interpret, you have to take the meaning and move it into some other form, which is useful for the next people coming along. And I think as architects, we are interpreters. We are trying to turn one set of models into a different set that we can use in order to get to the next level. So the essence of the book really is to go through these 4 major phases and some of the managerial considerations all around it. So the first one is we need to define what the business is. We need to design the business, which is often seen as our classic business architecture and business design. We actually then have to build it, and then we have to run it. And so this sort of comes into these 4 major phases. I'm going to go through each one of these, and that's going to be the essence of the presentation. So there's a bunch of stuff we do at the beginning. And in each one of these sort of has this 4 block. You can tell I'm enamored by 4 blocks. Where basically there's a bunch of work that needs to be done. The important thing about a lot of this, though, is this little circle which sits in all of them. And that is, I can gather a certain amount of information. So typically we'll start in the bottom left if we had to have a sequence. And we sort of work our way around. But what this really says is that it's better done in sort of this agile style of iteration and learning and building and adding as we're going all the way through. And so it's not like get this perfect, then get this perfect, then get this perfect, then get this perfect. It's you sort of iterating this as you're going. And as you get to the 3rd or the 4th block, you realize, oh, I need to change something in the 1st block or the 2nd block, or I've learned something up in this one, which might impact back on this one. So it is, this issue about learning is really, really important. This learning as we're going. So, and again, I'll go through each one of these in just a moment. In the design of the business, we're very much about, again, the pretty classic stuff of value streams, value chains, business processes, business capabilities, business information. And I've added to this one, I think is critical, and that is business performance. How do you measure all of this stuff? This measurement is critical. Now, at some point in time, we have to build things, which starts with prioritization, portfolios, basically roadmaps and schedules, and of course, sooner or later, someone has to actually build something in multiple domains. And then when we live happily ever after, that's the dream. The dream is the green. We execute the business. We continue to assess it according to the performance indicators we establish here. We make sure we have governance and sustainment so we can keep it alive, not just do it and then in 3 years do it all again and start from scratch. And of course, we have continuous improvement. And this whole, I've been looking for a piece of software which will give me a Mobius strip where I can actually turn this and wrap it back on itself. Because as we're doing all of this work here, we're going to impact back on the strategy. And the world is going to be changing, and the cycle really never stops. As a matter of fact, any organization is probably in all of this all at the same time, even though it's shown from a logical point of view. They're doing all this stuff at the same time. So now, what I've realized, I got 4 of these, one for each one, just to say, what have I tried to emphasize in the book? Okay, and this one here says you have to have some idea of your business model. You have to understand your external pressures. If you don't understand what's going on, I mean, like COVID was one of those things, right? You have to understand what's important to your external stakeholders. So the philosophy is an outside-in philosophy. Begin with the end in mind. This is the end. We'll synthesize out of that some sort of North Star, which is just a subset of the big set of complex statements that we get over here. And also we'll look at what are the strategic requirements. Some people would call these critical success factors, and some people might even call these strategic capabilities, not to be confused with functional capabilities, okay? Come back to that later. What goes wrong here? If you launch architecture without having some idea of what's happening here, it's going to be very, very difficult to come up with a good result that makes a difference. So first one of these is quite often the strategic intention, not to be confused with strategy. Strategy is how we're going to do it. But the strategic intention is not credible in the organization. They're just statements, which are statements of unrealistic intention, which may be there. Or it's not compelling. It'd be one way or the other, right? No big deal, no big deal, right? Or it may not be credible. It could be vague. It could be stated, but no one has any idea what that means or how to translate it down to what they're doing. Too complex or too simple, those extremes as well. And quite often it's not very performance centric. It's a bunch of statements of the things we need to do, but it's not a very good statement of the performance results we're trying to accomplish. And later on, everything else we do is not traceable back to this performance. It really has to be. It's inside out. I see this over and over and over again. It's supposed to be all about the customer and all these kinds of things. I'm going to give you a good example. Yesterday, I was on a call with a company in Australia, and they had just done some of this sort of strategic work. And I saw, and they said, well, really, as an architecture group, we're trying to support the AI group, because the AI group has a goal of having AI somewhere in every single process of the organization. So their goal was to implement AI. The goal wasn't to make a difference in the business and use AI where it can make a difference. See the difference? And so, so they're going to run around, look at every single process, implement something about AI, whether it's needed or not, as opposed to focus in the right place. Or it's just an exercise. That's the other thing that happens a lot here. Like once a year, we go through all this. We have the strategy for the next month and a half, and we're going to do all this kind of stuff. And when we're done, we're done. Now we get on to our real work, and we can ignore all that, right? So we see a lot of that. But if you really want to get it right, we do have to separate ends from means, and we have to understand the ends before we understand the means. We talked about that. We need to make sure we have measurable outcome goals, and key performance indicators with targets. I mean, do we want to reduce our costs by 10% within 3 years, as an example? It needs to be stakeholder driven. It needs to be customer oriented. It needs to be end to end to deliver whatever is necessary to the customer, while not getting fined because we violated all the regulatory requirements, that type of thing. And we need to think about this as not just an annual exercise. It's something we're looking at all the time, and it's got to be communicated. So we have to be all on the same page with regard to where we want to go and the means by which, and the way we're actually going to get there. So next phase of this is all about building out the building blocks and getting them aligned. So again, this is we're calling this information. You can also call it business concepts at the architecture level. These might be conceptual information. When I say business processes, I include value streams in that process stack, and capabilities. Capabilities are going to be all the things we're going to have to put in place. So basically, we separate these two things. They're not the same thing. And by the way, there's been arguments for more than a decade over should I go process centric or should I go capability centric? And what you tend to find is the more business oriented it is, the more we're going to be a bit more looking at value streams and things like that. And the more we're driving towards building things like IT solutions and service-oriented architecture, microservices, those types of things, the more it tends to be capability-centric. At the end of the day, they have to be both there in order to get things done. Because I do work in my processes operationally, and I have to build the capabilities so I can do that work and meet the performance targets that I'm looking at. So these all have to work together. Of course, information is flowing all around us. I mean, the performance data has got to be articulated as the data about what is going to be key. And again, these things, as I'm doing these, I learn from the other ones, and I continue to update this and going forward. So one challenge here is that this is where you get into just pure dogmatism at times. I had another call earlier in the week, and there was just one group in there said, and they were basically said, well, we're all about products. We don't need processes or capabilities because we're doing products. Okay, well, I mean, you've got to come up with the idea for the product. You have to develop the product. You have to validate the product. You have to you have to launch the product. You have to monitor the product, and then you have to sell the product. And people have to pay you for the product. I mean, how can you say there's no process? And how can you say you don't need to worry about capability? It just makes no sense, right? But they are so convinced that that's the right way to do things. And as I said before, the argument over capabilities versus processes, I've tried in the book, I've tried to make sure that we have a balance between those two things. And I know there'll be pushback on this. I'm fully ready for the pushback from some camps that might say, you don't need one, you only need the other. And I'm saying you need both. And so that's the issue about a single domain. And quite often, a lot of the capabilities are functional. A lot of the activities we talk about are functional. And we don't see sort of end to end. We don't see from customer back to customer, which is what we talked about in the first block here. And people just jump into this and they ignore strategy. It's just a bunch of models they're working on and having fun with it. Some critical success factors: iteration, outside in. This is a critical one, and everybody says, "Oh, it's not a big deal for us." As soon as you get into it, it is. Everyone's speaking a different language, even though they think they're not. They're using the same words, and they mean different things, or they're using different words and they mean the same thing. And then we helped an organization do an integration last year, integration of two companies. They're all going to end up on the same SAP platform, but they just wanted to dive in and start doing all the technical integration. But we forced them, or convinced them, to stand back and say, are we even speaking the same language? Are we using different words? Let's get agreement on that, so that when we go into it, we don't end up finding out when we get to implementation that we understood things differently. And collaboration from upstream, strategy, and downstream, the people doing implementation. If you're an architect and there's a solution to be built, my strong recommendation is you have to stay with the initiative all the way through to finalization of the projects. Because it's like, you know, if you're building a big building, the architect doesn't leave when the architecture drawings are done. They stay to defend the integrity of the architecture when people are doing development and implementation. I think the architect doing this type of work needs to stick around. Quite often you don't see it. So a third one of these, this is, a lot of this is pretty classic stuff, portfolio management. But first of all is, what are your priorities going to be? What are all the things we're going to have to change? How can we time sequence them based upon resource availabilities and so on, and then actually do the work? And this can be many, many different domains here. Technology is one of several domains that has to be dealt with. There's things like policies and rules and procedures and strategies and organization and skills and competencies. There could be physical infrastructure depending upon your industry. All that stuff's going to have to get done. And so the portfolio management, the gating and things like that happens down here is going to be important too. What are the risks? This is a huge, huge, huge risk in my mind. Ignoring strategy and business design. Right? So if you ignore the strategy, you just go build what you think you should. If you ignore the business design, then and only deal off strategy, what you end up doing is you get these crazy things. And I'm sure you've all seen this a lot. The executives talk about all these wonderful things that they want to be able to do. And they do things like a SWOT analysis. And when they find a weakness, they say, we have a weakness. Let's do a project. We have an opportunity. Let's do a project. They completely fly over the architectural structure sitting in the middle that says, maybe that project you're going to do, if we do it slightly differently, serve many, many people, not just this one group. So the ignoring the stuff we talked about already and starting in here is not a good place to go, right? You need to do the other work first, in our experience. Separate professional groups basically define their own priorities. IT defines its own priority, and HR does its own priorities, but no one's talking to each other, right? So it's not synchronized. You see that a lot. The needs are determined functionally. Each group, each division, each section of the division, they do their own priorities and their own needs, and whether or not that actually fits together with all the other ones in the end-to-end journey to the customer is really a good question. And quite often this does become quite IT-centric because there's so much money spent on the IT part. Critical success factors: use the goals, use the KPIs, use the starting point of our current performance as criteria. So if I get a big performance gap, I probably need to really emphasize the things which have a high performance gap should get on the top part of the podium. All the aspects of design the business, and make sure we can track the plan changes to what's actually happening already. I mean, it's rare that I see an organization that doesn't say, oh, well, we've already started something on this. This is underway already. This project is half done. Well, you're going to have to catch that train in motion somehow if you're trying to sort of nudge with the architecture. So watch out for that. Last one of these then is basically then, as I said before, the risks down here. So this is like run the business, measure how we're doing, build. This is the other thing that's important here, is that so many of these things I see, and people don't focus on measurement as being a true capability that we need to put in place, a true ability to measure, that is, because they think about it later. Trying to add measurement on top of the architecture is really hard. You need to build it into the architecture. What data do you need? What kind of analytics are you going to want to do? What kind of insights do you want to gain by looking at being data-driven insights? You need to have the ability to build the data and the data reporting, data on data, of course, And then we need some governance over here and improvement. What's the risk? We don't implement well. We don't train the workers, and we don't sustain that. I've seen this a lot lately, where, you know, like dealing with financial advisors, dealing with mortgages, when we're talking to them, we're actually finding that the newer employees are doing a better job, because the older employees have not been kept up to date with training and all the new things that are happening, right? So that was a big surprise, actually. We go right back to functional management. Now's the opportunity. Manage end to end. Your data will be end to end, manage end to end. And your customers don't care about your org chart. They only care about whether it all works together. So back to my process management heritage. Also, there's no sustainment, there's no governance mechanisms put in place. And then 2 years from now, you start a new initiative and you start from scratch. All the models you built for the purpose of the one transformation are no longer valid. You haven't kept them up to date. Clear accountabilities for outcomes, not just functions. And basically the whole idea about collaboration. There's a lot of collaboration which has to be put in place across the organization chart. So put in critical success factors, build the measurement capability, put in some sort of process governance framework, some sort of center of excellence for continuous improvement practices, as well as governance support, help people do that. Train participants in how they contribute, not just their actions, but how they contribute to the end to end. And you have to put in place the ability to monitor and coach the behaviors you want in that end-to-end work that you're going to be doing. It's a cultural issue. It's not going to happen by itself. It has to be an active thing that happens. And of course, we'll come right back around to the beginning once again. So the challenge of this is that we quite often have functional perspectives. It's probably the biggest issue when we manage by org chart as opposed to managing by outcomes. We don't have accountabilities for those things. Everyone's doing the best they can. And each executive in charge of each function has a contradictory performance plan relative to one another, and none of them are aligned to what the customer cares about. I'm being a bit extreme, but we see that a lot. Traceability, measurement up and down, measurement across the board, and we jump to projects. This is the one of the biggest issues I see. And quite often we'll have executives saying, well, why do you need to do all the architecture stuff? We know what the problems are. How many times have you heard that? Oh, we know what the problems are. Let's go fix them. And then they go fix them, and they introduced unintended consequences. So the expression I like is the main cause of problems is solutions. And so the solution is just creating other things, and things don't fit. And you have consequences which weren't the positive one, right? Thank you, Dana. Basically no incentives, personal conflicts of interest, as I was just talking about. It's seen as something that got to get through, and the faster they get over it, the happier they're going to be. And quite often it's the challenge is we do an annual budget process. We do it for budgeting purposes, not for outcome purposes, right? Governance and so on. And you know what, you got to keep telling the story. I really do believe that business architects have got to be storytellers. People understand scenarios and situations and cases and things they've gone through, as opposed to talking in models. We need the models, but that's not necessarily the way we want to communicate.